Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new project within Unity. I'm just going to call this local co-op tut, and I've got that saved there. And then we just want to hit create. I'm not going to bother with any of the render pipelines just for simplicity. So we're just going to use the 3D kind of template here and hit create. And then once this loads up, we need to just enable a few packages. I'm going to go ahead and just skip the new version for now. I will download that in my own time. And then we just want to grab the window here. Your layout may look slightly different to mine. It may look just like this. I have a preferred layout. And all I've done is I've docked the game down here, put the console here, because you always need the console open to see what you're doing wrong. And then I have my inspector here. You should be able to follow along. If you don't know how to change your HUD, you can grab the tabs and just snap them to where you want them. And you can make them match this if you like. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're going to go up to the to Window and Package Manager. I'm going to bring the Package Manager over. And then we're going to go from Packages, the in project, to the Unity registry. And we are going to enable Pro Builder, which is here. We won't need it straight away, really. We're going to enable Pro Builder, which is here. And then we want to enable the input system. It's currently on version 1.02. It might be a bit later along, depending on when you're watching this video. But we'll just hit install. This is going to want to restart the editor, so we'll need to just click OK to that when that happens. So we'll just click yes here. And that's just going to disable the old input system and enable the new input system. And we can just close the package manager for now. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, so I'm just going to fly the camera down here, and I'm going to go up to Tools, Pro Builder Window, and then let's snap that here. And then using the Pro Builder window, I'm just going to hit New Shape, choose Plane. We can just set this to, so we don't need it that big, like 30 by 30. We can always extend it. I'm going to hit Build, and then close the Shape tool, go back over to the, close the Pro Builder window. I'm going to select the plane. I'm just going to center it in the world over there. Actually, no, we need to go back to the Pro Builder window, sorry. And we want to center the pivot, so then we can snap it to the middle of our world here. If you want to change the color so it's not this bright white, we can do that. Do that by clicking on vertex colors, and then from this palette we can pick this kind of green or the blue. Go for the, we'll go for this blue, this blue color for now. We can close that. We can close this. I'm just going to make myself a bit of room here. I'm going to grab the camera, and we can see the main camera view down here. I'm just going to bring it up. Rotate it by holding down Control. Just bring it up so it's got a bit of a bit more of an angle, and so we can see the corners of our map. I think this is actually going to be a bit too big, so we can change that later. That's fine. Okay, so we've got our floor. The next thing we want to do is we want to go to Game Object, create a 3D object, and it's going to be a, create empty. And this is just going to be our player prefab, we'll call it. I'm going to center it on the X, 0.5 on the Y, and then center it on the Z. Actually, I'll put that 0 on the Y for now. because then we know that this empty is the floor of the object. To the player prefab, we're going to go to game object, 3D object, add in a capsule. Drag that over onto the player prefab. 0 on the X, 0.5 on the Y, and 0 on the Z. Okay, 1 on the Y, not 0.5. So now you can see that the cube is sat on the floor, or stood on the floor. To get some quick, simple movement, we're just going to go over to the link in the description, which is this Move controller over on the Unity website. I'm going to copy all of this, just steal all of that, press copy, move that out of the way, and then on our player prefab, like empty, the top level, the parent, I'm going to add a component, new script, and we'll call this the player controller. And we'll open up that in Visual Studio. Okay, over in Visual Studio, we're going to delete all of this and paste in the code that we got from the internet. And then instead of being called example, we just need to make sure this is player controller. This has to match whatever you named the file. So if you called it something else, like just player, this would have to say player, not player controller. And we're just going to type up here, require component type of character controller. And that's just going to make sure that we have a character controller assigned. I'm just going to save that script, go back over here. And just because I'd already attached the script, we'll have to just put the character controller on it. But in the future, it just means that if we place this script on any other object, it will add that character controller. Okay, and you can see that the character controller, the kind of capsule controller that has come with it, is down here. We just need to raise this up by 1, just so it matches our capsule here. If we hit play at the minute, it won't actually do anything. We'll get some errors. And that is because in void start, we're trying to add component character controller. What we actually want to do is in void awake, we want to get component, and we want to get the character controller component that we've just added. So now if we save, that should get rid of that error. But we do get this error here, which is from the old input class, because now we've swapped over to the new input system, we can't actually use get axis horizontal and vertical. So to solve that, what we're going to do is we are going to get a game object, create another empty, and we're just going to name this player input. Again, I'm just going to center this on the X, Y, and Z. And to this, I'm going to add a player input component. Okay, so on this player input, you'll see here that it says none, input action asset under actions. Unity does come with default actions, and it'll create things like movement and things like that. If you want to use that, feel free. You can just click create actions. But I want to do it manually just so we can go through that setup process. So I'm just going to make a new folder and call it input. And then in input, we can go to component. We can go to assets, create, and then we can create a new input actions. And we're just going to call this player controls. If we go back to our player input empty, we can add the player controls over to the action asset here. And we want to change behavior from send messages to invoke Unity events. And then we're just going to double click on the player controls asset to get this new window. And I'm just going to hit autosave. so it saves it as we go along. And the first thing that we need to do is make a action map, which we can just call player. You can have different action maps which have different things. You could have a on foot action map, you could have a driving action map, and then the actions on that action map could do different things. But for now, we're just gonna have the one action map called player, and we've got this new action here. So what we're gonna do is just double click it and call this call it movement, and then under action type, we're gonna have movement and we're gonna have value, and we're gonna right click our movement action and click on add 2D vector composite. We can get rid of this empty binding here. Can delete that. We can rename this 2D vector to just WASD, and then so up we can listen, press W. Down we can listen and press S. Left path listen A, and then right path listen D. So what this is going to do is when we press W, A, S, or D, it's going to return a vector 2, which we're going to use to move our player. So that's auto-saved. We can just press X to get rid of that. Now, under our player input, we've now got this invoke Unity events, and we can see our player, and then we've got our movement script here. To get this to work and actually move our character, we're going to have to just do a couple of things, a bit of refactoring. We're just going to add a new component. I'm going to make a new script. I'm just going to call this the player input handler. And I'm going to double click to open the player input handler. We can get rid of the start and update, and then we just need to come up to here where it says using, and then type in using Unity engine.input system. And now that will allow us to say void on move. I'm going to press escape so it doesn't autofill, and then we can do input action dot callback context, and we'll just call this context. And we also want to do a public game object player prefab, and then a public player controller called player controller. And then in void awake, what we want to do, so we can make that just a private player controller, and then in void awake, we want to say that if player prefab is not equal to null, then player controller equals player prefab dot get component get component of type player controller. And then if we press control and click on player controller, we can come back over to our player controller, and then down here we also need to put using Unity engine.input system, and then down here we'll do void on move input action dot callback context, and we'll just call this context. And what we're going to do is we are going to cut this vector3 move line from the update, pop it down here. I'm going to paste that down there, and then we're just going to make a temporary vector2 called movement, and then that will equal context.readValue vector2. And then here we can say that this vector3 is equal to movement dot x, and the vertical will be movement dot y. And then in the player input handler, we can say player controller dot on move, and we'll pass in that context. And we're going to say player controller on move context, and then we just want to go back over to our player controller, and we can see that we've got an error here. That's because we need to just copy this vector 3 move, and then remove the vector 3 part, come up to the top, and then we can do private vector 3 move. So that should be working now. We just hit save and let this recompile. The reason we're doing it this way and not having this input system, this player input component on the player prefab, is because we want to support having different prefabs and they might move in different ways. So this way it just allows it to be modular. So we've got the input handler. We're going to drag the player prefab over onto the player input and parent the player prefab to the player input component. So I'm just going to make a new folder and call this prefabs. I'm going to get the player prefab empty from the world, click it into the prefabs folder, and under player input, we can now drag that player prefab. And then under player input here, we've got the player prefab, which is here. So now we've got a couple of errors here. Let's have a look. That's because we're trying to we've got this about jumping. We're using the old input system, which we don't want to use for now. We can always add it back in later. Let's see if that's worked. Let that recompile. Still trying to use. Okay, so those errors have now gone. What we're going to do is under the player input, on the player input component, we just want to expand events, expand player, and you'll see the movement here, which refers back to the action map that we made. We can just click the little plus here. We can drag the player input handler script onto where it says none. Then we can go function, player input handler, and choose our we just need to make this public, and then we can choose our onMove function underneath the movement section. Move. So now we hit play. Nothing happens. Okay, impromptu debugging session finished. What had happened was that under player input, I dragged the player prefab from here into this. We actually want it to be the one that's parented to it. So make sure under player input, you drag this player prefab, not this one, into the player prefab slot. And you see the player input handler, this is calling the onMove function. That's going to go to the player controller, which is going to set this vector, update the move value, and then that's going to controller.move. That's going to move our object. You can see that when you hit play, it's really slow. That's easy enough to fix. What we can do, let me just get rid of this debug.log. Instead of this being private, we can add a serialize field before it. Let that reload. And now under the player prefab that's here, we can player speed, maybe bump this up to 7. I'm just going to apply that to the prefab. And now you see that we're moving a lot quicker. Okay, so now that's set up and we know that the controller's working, we can actually delete this prefab from the scene. Okay, so with our player input here, we're just going to drag that over into the prefabs as well. And then we're going to preset this up. So now we can drag this one into the player prefab slot here. The reason we're doing that is so that when we spawn in, we'll instantiate this prefab where we spawn. And the reason we've done this is that I could have prefab 2, and we could change the color on it, and then we could like randomly pick which prefab we're using. So it supports multiple prefab. So I could drag this in. We could have an array of prefabs on the player input handler script, and then it could randomly pick which one we want to do. But for now, I'm just going to delete this prefab here so we don't get confused. So we've got the player input and the player prefab. Okay, so now we want to go to create empty, and we're just going to call this the game manager. And we're going to add a new script to this called game manager, which we'll just leave empty for now. And we're going to add in a player input manager as well. Okay, so with this player input manager and the game manager, where it says player prefab here, we just want to drag in the player input one, not the player prefab. I know that's confusing wording, but just drag over player input, and then in our player input here, it looks like our action asset's been removed. So we'll just drag that back over and just confirm that that's still there, which it is. That's great. Okay, we'll hit save. Okay, so if we go to the player input handler, in our awake here, if player prefab isn't null. Okay, so now we just need to change this slightly. So if player prefab isn't null, what we're going to do is we are going to instantiate our prefab into the world, and we're going to store a reference to its controller in this player controller variable. So what we can do is we can do game object dot instantiate, and it's going to be the player prefab. It's going to be based on our transform. It's going to spawn it at the starting position, which we'll set in a second. And it can just match our own rotation. And once that is instantiated, we can get component, and that'll be the player controller. And it's looking for a start pos, so we're going to do vector3 start pos. I'm just going to equal this to a new vector3 of 0, 0, 0. And we can change the start position if we need to a bit later on. So I'm just going to... So what we're doing here is we are instantiating our object, and we're also storing a reference to its player controller at the same time. So it's just saving us a line of code. And then what we want to do is we're going to set our own parent, so the parent of the player input. And then what we want to do is we want to become the child of that player. So we move along with the player controller, which we can do by just saying transform.parent equals player controller.transform. So now with our okay, so now under game manager, we've got our player input, which has got the player prefab. We don't have our input action asset. We've set our input action asset, and then under game manager, we've set it here. So we've got this to join behavior, join players when button is pressed. So we're just going to get rid of the player input from the world. And then if we hit play, and then press like a button on our keyboard, it'll spawn a version of the player. Just ignore those errors for now. And then if we hit A on a controller, it'll happen. Okay, so if we select our game manager and hit play, you see that when a button is pressed, I'll press space on the keyboard, our player is joined. And to enable controller support, I can press A on this other controller, and I'm on a controller now, and that is moving. That won't work straight away. What you need to do is over in the player controls in the input, and there's just a few things we need to change. I'll remove them here just so we can start again. Okay, so to enable the controller support, what we need to do is we need to go over to movement and make sure the action type is pass through and the control type is vector 2. And then under control schemes, we just want to add a control scheme, and we're just going to call this key B and M. And where it says list is empty, we can select keyboard, we can select mouse, and just mouse, and hit save. And now under our WAS and D, we can choose these, choose keyboard and mouse for these. And then to enable us to be able to use a controller and have those be two separate control schemes, we need to add another control scheme. Call this gamepad. Where it says list is empty, go to gamepad, gamepad, save. Now you'll see that it looks like they've disappeared, but it's just because we haven't actually signed anything up to the game to work with gamepad yet. So under movement, we just click this little plus, add binding, and then just choose the left stick. Go back to all control schemes, and now we can see that these are our keyboard and mouse controls, and this is our gamepad control. And then the last thing we need to do is if we go over to our player prefab, the player input prefab that we made, this might be selected for you. So auto switch, default scheme, any. Okay, so with that done, if we hit play now, you can see that we can press space, we're on the keyboard, and then we can hit A on a controller, and we're on the controller. And we've got two capsules moving independently from one another. So that is local co-op working, but this is where it starts to get annoying, and we're gonna have to start doing stuff manually, because there's a massive bug where it's quite annoying to load into a level and the player's not there, and then suddenly you have to press W and then you're there. Normally you'd want to load into a level and you would be there in the world and you just start. You don't want to have to load a level, press a button to join the level. And the annoying bug is this. So if we drag our player input into the world, so we can be at 0, 0, 0. Okay, look what happens now. So on our player input, we've got our input action asset set up. If we hit play, we'll spawn in and then we can move. But as soon as we bring in a second player, you can see here that it now says actions type mismatch. And it works fine. But what happens then is if you stop playing on the player input, it comes up actions, missing input action asset. So if we were to replay, we wouldn't actually be able to control them. We start getting lots of errors because you can see that the player prefab, remember we set the player input, this is the empty. There isn't an input action asset, so it doesn't know how to control it. And this is a really frustrating bug. It frustrated me for ages, and that is the point of this series. I'm going to show you how to get around this issue. So just delete the player input from the world and then drag the player controls back in into here, and you can see that this way it works again, where you press a button, you join, and you join with the other controller. And if you don't mind that, that's fine. That's local co-op working. But if we want to get a bit more in depth and do what I showed off in the trailer, we need to just take this a bit further. So that's where we are with this now. Make sure to subscribe to see part 2. I've pre-recorded all of these tutorials, so they're scheduled to go up one a week. You can hit the notification bell to know when the next part of the tutorial goes live. As always, the project files for this are over on my Patreon, and so is the full tutorial series. So if you don't want to wait a week for the next part, you can head over to the Patreon. Link is below, and you can get access to the full tutorial series over there. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye.